quick follow-up. A quick follow-up for Cristobal. Just a kind of a technical question on this model specification issue, which is really fascinating and really provides a kind of an exciting set of methods for investigating our decisions. On the other hand, you know, as somebody who specifies these models, generally I'll have some expectations about what I think a good model should look like. I'll say, okay, well, you know, OLS is really, you know, it's pretty wrong for this, you know, I could use it in this case, but its assumptions are violated fairly significantly. You know, negative binomial is a little bit better, Poisson is a little bit better, or something like this. Similarly, for the control structure, I might say, well, okay, it doesn't make sense to put in, you know, race and not gender in this case. If I'm going to put in one, I'm going to put in both. I have a lot of kind of domain expertise here. And I think that's kind of, you know, this broader issue of how to integrate domain expertise with variability is relevant for replication as well. But I wonder if you think about, okay, we've got a mechanistic procedure for testing all of these possibilities, but is there a way to weight them by the kind of relative plausibility so that the tail doesn't include things that are just kind of pure wrong for a domain expert?
Yeah, yeah, no, certainly I'm concerned about this kind of thing a lot, and, you know, just sort of giving you guys a flavor of what might be possible in a more transparent world. But we don't want to include sort of dumb models in the mix. You know? One of the things that I've developed is what I call a sort of modeling, the model influence estimator. So we can take each model ingredient and show how much it affects the distribution, how much it affects the results. So rather than including a control variable and say, how does it affect the outcome? Well, for a control variable, we don't really care. You know, we're interested in how it affects our estimate of interest. So, you know, we can look at each element of the model and see when you control for certain variables, how does it, often, you know, they don't do anything at all, and then some are really important. So it tells you exactly what's at stake in each sort of model decision. So, meant to be informative.
Following up on that question, it strikes me that a combination of pre-registration and reporting all possible specifications seems like a useful combination. So you could commit ex ante. We will report all possible specifications, but these are the set of specifications that we regard as likely to be most informative. And I wonder if you could comment on that, especially for large data sets, observational data sets, and the viability of committing ex ante to pre-analysis plans. The difficulty seems to be that when you specify your analysis before collecting the data, it's easy to check the timestamps on those. When you're dealing with observational data, maybe a data set that you've already been working with, that you've published on before, the timing of your learning about the data gets more complicated.
I would just jump in and say, I think one thing that's true about many of these proposed changes is that we're going to have to trust researchers to some extent, and we're going to have to decide that some things are fraud. So to pre-register something after you've actually collected the data, but pretend that it was before, we're never going to be able to completely prevent that, right? Unless, well, with data collected online, there's a timestamp, but if it's in the lab, you know, it might not be possible to guarantee. So to some extent, we're going to have to define very clearly what counts as fraud and trust people not to commit those things, or have some verification, but there's always going to be some amount of trust too.
Yeah, and I mean, as far as, I think it's far more clear how the pre-specification works for randomized trials, so you do have to trust that people haven't already collected the data. But as far as the example, the minimum wage example, that's pretty much the only one I know of that's used observational data. So I think there's far more opportunities than just the one to do that, but it is harder to apply the pre-specification with observational data that you've already, I mean, in some sense, so Newmark, right, he'd already written a dozen papers, not a dozen, he'd already written multiple papers about the minimum wage, so he knew like what specification would make sense, and I think that's fine. Like, but because it was completely new data, it was a new change in the minimum wage. And so he ran essentially the same specification as he'd run before with different data. He just said, like, okay, well, here's the, over time, I've done exploratory work. I think this is the specification that makes the most sense. And the government has changed the minimum wage in 97 or whatever. Changed the minimum wage, so I know that the new data is coming out 6 months after that. I'm pre-specifying this, that in 6 months when that data comes out, this is the specification I'm going to run.
Another thing labs could do, and this gets at Michael's question too, is pre-registered general rules. So in my area of research, it never makes sense to control for only race or gender, so I'm always going to control for both or neither. And if you pre-register that within your domain of research, within your lab, maybe then that could be considered pre-registered for any analyses you do after that.
I also, too, wonder whether just, like, I mean, going through this, having all this information available, you still have to use your judgment in terms of in defending the model that you settle on, and I think that knowing the extent, I mean, just knowing the robustness of that is useful information in terms of evaluating our confidence. So you might make an argument that this one out in the tail is the right, you know, the best one, even though it's not the, you know, and you might be able to make a good argument for that. Yeah. So it's just more information that helps us understand the uncertainty of these things, but it doesn't take away our need for judgment.
Yeah, I think, you know, with the Newmark study on the minimum wage, you know, as you said, this is a research area where he'd been studying for many years. He'd been using the CPS data for many years. And it was just really, this is going to be, when the new wave comes out, I'm going to do exactly what I've done before on the new wave of these data that I've analyzed extensively before. So, you know, I thought that was a great little study on a great use of pre-registration. But, you know, when you're starting on a new project, it does involve a lot of exploratory work. Very hard to pre-register, yeah, observational. But I do love, in principle, the idea, if you could, you knew a lot about your field area, if you could pre-register it, indicate what you thought were the best and most compelling model specifications, show the full distribution, so that other people can come along and say, well, I don't really buy your argument about what's the best one. Mine's over here. People can look at that estimate as well. So, yeah, it's a great combination. When it can be done, I think it's hard.
So I thought these were, all three presentations were really, really interesting and really thought-provoking. But I'd love to hear your thoughts on, you know, I think another trend in the social sciences, which I think, you know, potentially creates problems with replicability, which is, I think a trend that I've been seeing certainly within economics toward the use of either, you know, proprietary data sources where you're obtaining data from a company and signing a data use agreement in order to get access to that, or I mean even in the context of, you know, restricted census data or a bunch of these sort of restricted data sources that the government has available, and sort of what you see sort of the challenges and what might be the approaches to handling replicability in a context in which a lot of future research is going to be driven by those types of data sources.
Yeah, so in economics, at least, as of last week, the top 5 all have a data sharing policy. The QJE didn't until last week, but now we do. So 5 for 5 in the top 5, but it's all the same policy from the American Economic Association, which is if it's proprietary data, you just have to tell us that when you submit, and then you're out. Like, it's fine. I'm okay with that. I guess I'm optimistic, or I'm seeing it as a glass half full, that we've moved in the right direction, that if it's public data, we at least want to get these policies in place before we're like really being upset about the people who use proprietary data from corporations or something. And I myself, like, even though I'm an advocate for this, my research is on food stamps, and it's all like geolocated health data from the government, so I have to go sit inside the basement of a controlled room and nothing can leave the room and that sort of stuff. So I think there are things that what I plan to do to that is like to in detail describe the process of getting access to the data and exporting to the real world as many of my scripts as I can get them to approve for review. But yeah, it is totally a pain in the butt to get special sworn status and do the security clearance and stuff, so I don't know that that's a great answer. But yeah, someone else could do it. And hopefully I can describe as much of it as possible so that they can.
Do you have a response to the question?
Yeah, sort of a response. So there are things you can do even with proprietary data sets. So even if you can't post the data, you can post the structure of the data file. So here are all the variable names. You can post the analysis code. And I have a colleague at UC Berkeley, Andy Rose, who commits to running your analysis on his code. Like, I can't post the data, but if you send me your code, I'll run it on my data and send you the output. He also says, I won't debug your code if it doesn't work. But very few people take him up on the software anyway, so it hasn't been an issue.
I would just add also, it's really important for both reviewers and editors to insist that manuscripts contain the important descriptive statistics, so basic correlations, means, standard deviations. With simulation, we can reproduce a lot of what the data would look like without actually having the data in hand, and I think this is something that'll be continuing to develop into the future, that we get ways to sort of still look at the basic structure of the data without actually having the data.
I think also, I mean, one of the things is as we move towards releasing what we can and getting a sense about whether the things that are published in the published version don't match what people do when they try to replicate it. Again, it gives us a bigger sense of how, a better sense of how big of an issue some of the things we're concerned about are. And it may be that we get to the point where once we see how it works with data that are accessible to other people and that there are a lot of concerns and questions, we might end up trusting those proprietary data sources less, and we might actually, as we move down this road towards greater transparency and openness, that becomes one of the things that we evaluate when we say whether this is a good project or not, or a good paper or not. And it may be that we ultimately move towards something where we just value those less, and that's something that comes into play when we consider it for publication.
Thanks, this is fascinating. I want to dig in a little more to Cristobal's point about this being a collective action problem. I think we're starting to have a pretty good sense of what's needed, but the incentives are currently obviously misaligned, right? There's a selection process for bad practices right now. So I want to hear from you what you see as the rising institutions that could deal with these issues.
We have a panel this afternoon on journal policies. I think that's one of the big gatekeepers. I think grant agencies maybe even bigger. And then I think if things change at those levels, it will necessarily trickle down to institutions and hiring committees and promotion, but there will be a gap. There'll be people who are caught in the middle, right? That maybe they need to do certain things to publish or get grants, but their promotion committees still expect them to do different things. So that's a problem. But I think the places to start, in my view, are journals, societies, and grant agencies. How to do that, though, is a different question.
So a question on pre-specification, pre-analysis plans. As a researcher, I actually think it's a big improvement in the discussion you hear from a researcher when they can distinguish in their discussion or in the paper between a confirmatory test and an exploratory test. And so, I was recently at a conference with Ted Miguel, and he did a masterful job. Sort of, here's what we pre-specify. These are the pre-specified results. Now I'm going to show you a bunch of exploratory results. These were not pre-specified, so he kept sort of raising this caveat. I think that's good practice. I do wonder, it's hard enough, I think, to convey the idea of statistical significance to kind of a wider audience. That I do wonder if that distinction that matters maybe to us, that we sort of, whether it actually, and that's sort of a higher level of appreciation for statistical inference. So in the media or in sort of wider circles where just the idea of statistical significance is a hard one to convey, whether the distinction, I mean, whether everything that's explored, if there's sort of a blank check for exploratory work, and there's a lack of appreciation in some ways for the distinction, whether that's a complication, whether that improves things or complicates things. I'm curious what you think.
That's a good point. I'd say it's really hard to predict what the masses will understand or how they'll interpret things. But I think sort of a difference or a way we could frame the difference between confirmatory and exploratory is that if you've pre-specified a test, then you can, not that people understand what p-values are, but if you do a confirmatory test, like you can interpret the p-value at face value. And exploratory work, unless you're doing more complicated multiple testing adjustments, then it's less clear that you should really interpret that p-value at face value. So as far as, I mean, I suppose you could just say, like, this confirmatory test you can trust more than the exploratory stuff, and I don't know that the I don't know.
I mean, it may be just good for the person that's doing the research, though, to kind of just have this very, very explicit signal that, all right, this one you have to be extra, extra cautious about, and this one I shouldn't write a press release about. And so it may be that it is not something that actually will ever get translated that well to the public in terms of their interpretation of things, but as a step for us to remind ourselves to be more careful about things, I think that can be a useful signal.
Danny Kahneman once talked about the fount of hindsight wisdom that comes to you once your preferred hypothesis is not supported. And, you know, that's an important part of the research process, and we don't want to make it go away, but we do want to distinguish it from, you know, what we went into thinking was, you know, an ideal design. One of the things he was talking about that is, you know, a process of adversarial collaboration where, you know, you and I disagree about some finding about subjective well-being, and so we agree to a process where we'll both analyze the data set, we'll both propose, you know, methodologies, designs that we both agree that seems very reasonable, and then go from there.
But I don't think it's that much of a negative. Like if you look at Nate Silver in the popular press, like he is clearly predicting something, and then people understand, all right, he got 99 out of 100 of these things right, with a model that was clearly like he was out there saying these things would happen before they happened, and then they happened. So that's the confirmatory test, and people can understand, people I think would be able to, hopefully be able to distinguish between that sort of predictive and confirmatory test versus like, oh, he just looked at the data and said like, oh, there are these correlations and things like that afterwards.
Thank the panel as well. So my question was animated by Garrett's talk. Much of sociology is strongly inductive, and I think about ethnographies or grounded theory. And in a pre-registration world, I don't see how we accommodate that inductive part of the discipline, and that leads me to wonder, could we be inadvertently creating a hierarchy of science again in which qualitative and inductive research gets pushed off the table as acceptable approaches to trying to understand the world?
I think that's right. I mean, sociology is definitely this field of mixed methods, and there seems to be not very much appetite at the ASA, at the professional level, to really sort of sort this out. And I think part of it is this concern that, you know, quantitative methods are trying to develop these things that will break this armor of, you know, respectability, and it leaves, it seems to leave qualitative research out in the cold and essentially devalue that work because it's harder to develop. Or at least it's less clear how to develop these kinds of. So I think, you know, qualitative research is something that I really value. Qualitative research have a problem with viciously attacking each other's work and just saying that it's completely fabricated, and every person who's ever done a major qualitative book has had somebody say, you made this whole thing up. Alice Goffman's the most recent, but, you know, just a line of sequences. You know, there's a guy, Martin Sanchez at Berkeley. He came and gave a talk about inequality, and he started his talk by saying, okay, so Jack Katz at UCLA says I made up everything in this book, but it's not true. Okay, let me tell you about it. It's just like, how can I even listen to you? I've never heard your stuff before. I'm just wondering, is this all made up, you know? And it's very frustrating because it's really exciting. It's really interesting, engaging, rich work. And it seems like qualitative researchers have not developed a way to have it, what's the defense? It's like being called a Nazi. It's like, no, I'm not, you know? And it's like, that doesn't convince anyone. I find it really troubling that I hope that there would be some advancement of that to bring down some of that. Yeah, I think it's a great point.
So I'll just say that I haven't heard anyone in the social sciences say that they would hope that we publish only pre-specified work. So that is the case at some medical journals. Like if you do an RCT and it's not registered, the top journals will not publish it. But I haven't heard anyone say that in the social sciences, and I certainly haven't said it, and I don't think that's our plan. So I don't mean to stigmatize exploratory work. I just would like them to be clearly labeled what is what.
So I think one thing that comes up a lot when we talk about pre-registration is this fear that there's going to be a hierarchy, that pre-registered work, confirmatory work is going to be seen as better. And then we try to say, no, that's not what we're saying. But let's be honest. It is, on one dimension, we are saying that pre-registered and confirmatory results should be trusted more than exploratory results. But that's one dimension. And as someone who does completely exploratory research, I'm fine with giving more confidence to those people who are able to do confirmatory research. I think the value from my research comes from other dimensions. So I think I do some things that would be very, very hard to pre-register. And so I provide rich data that way. And my conclusions should be less confident. I should be less confident in my conclusions than they can be in theirs. But what I'm adding is something different than confidence. It's not the only dimension that matters. So I think we should be honest about that. But it's not the end of exploratory research.
One more question.
So I see that similar distinction between exploratory and hypothesis-driven research in biology, and with the exploratory research being devalued, and so that people try to construct hypotheses out of really exploratory work. Is it possible to pre-register an exploratory study in the way that you would want to lay out at least what your study details are to know that you're going to have enough power to even start to generate hypotheses from the data? Because that's a challenge too in terms of people constructing the study to start.
Yeah, I'm not sure I would call it pre-registration, but I think transparency still helps a lot with exploratory research. So one thing we're working towards is putting our code book up online so everyone can see every variable we measured at every time point and so on, so that if we show you, look, this correlates with that, but we measured it 4 other ways and at 3 other time points, you can know that we're cherry picking. So I think transparency goes a long way, but I wouldn't call that pre-registration. And I'm not sure, I think what you're talking about is a little bit different. I'm not really answering your question. I do think, I don't know. I'm not sure what the added value is in pre-registering your question in your design.
Value. So I think that it helps improve the quality of the project, regardless of whether it increases confidence in the p-values or the test that you ultimately get from it. So if the work is going to be of higher quality, then I think it's absolutely worth it to do it. And it's really more of a spectrum from exploratory to confirmatory. So, it's not strictly confirmatory in the way that a strong pre-registered test is, but it's somewhere closer to it than just not having any pre-specified plan at all.
It's also possible, I think that I resonate with this idea that you kind of have your exploratory study and you're kind of forced to make these, make it seem like it was this confirmatory study because that's what gets valued. But it is possible that once we are able to more often recognize this distinction there, that actually people will be more willing to, they'll realize when they're doing exploratory stuff more, they'll be more willing to recognize the benefits of the difficult exploratory work that they're doing. They'll be willing to recognize that the confirmatory stuff is actually much rarer than it appears in the literature when everyone is selling these sorts of things. And so maybe we actually might value the exploratory stuff a little bit more when we can actually kind of be more careful about how we separate these things as well.
Yeah, and I think there are degrees of pre-registration. So to the extent that you do know some things ahead of time, absolutely making those things public helps. Yeah. That's all the time we have. Thank you.